Hello and welcome back. Thank you very much for tuning back in again. This is part 2 of the screencast presentation for Japanese Imperialism. American ships and Japanese boats. As you can imagine, the Japanese felt the pressure from Commodore Matthew Perry. A Japanese official realized that they were overmatched by the US naval ships too. It must have been a sightly endeavor for them to actually understand the dynamics of the US military and especially the naval forces for the time. When Matthew Perry returned in 1854, Japanese officials signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, which opened 2 ports to American merchants. Now, after the United States opened the door to Japanese trade in 1854, other Western powers entered Japan. By 1860, England, France, the Dutch, Russia, and the United States all had unequal trade treaties and extraterritorial rights in Japan. To say that these agreements were a little bit messy is a little bit of an understatement. The Japanese became angry that the shogun had given in to the foreigners' demands, and feared Japan would become as powerless as China did too, if you remember that from the previous unit. So in 1867, the Tokugawa shogun stepped down, which brought an end to the 600 years of military dictatorship in Japan. Emperor Mutsuhito took control of the government and took the title of Meiji, or enlightened ruler. Let's go ahead and do critical thinking decision number 2, the Meiji Restoration. Going back to the dock here, the Japanese were angry that the shogun had given in to the foreigners' demands that granted Western powers humiliating trade rights and extraterritorial rights, with allowed foreigners exemption from Japanese laws. The Japanese were so outraged that the shogun had a dramatic change occurred. In 1867, the Tokugawa shogun stepped down, ending the military dictatorships that had lasted since the 12th century. Japanese citizens turned to Japan's young emperor, Mutsuhito, who seemed to symbolize the country's sense of pride and nationalism. For most of Japan's history, the emperor was a figurehead with little power, but beginning in 1868, Emperor Mutsuhito took control of the government. He chose the name Meiji for his reign, which means enlightened rule, and Mutsuhito's reign lasted 45 years and was known as the Meiji Restoration. What should the new Japanese emperor do? Continue to trade with Western powers in order to avoid war with industrial nations? Learn from the Western nations and modernize Japan's industry, government, and military? Prepare samurai warriors for war and rebel against Western imperialists and reclaim Japan? Or seek China's advice on how to resist imperialists and form an alliance with other Asian nations? Well, here's actually what they ended up doing. Of course, the answer here is B. Please go ahead and record B in your notes. Let's proceed to the next part of the presentation. So the Meiji Emperor realized that the best way to end Western influence was to modernize. Japan sent diplomats to Europe and America to study Western ways and adapt them to their own country too. Additionally, Japan admired Germany's government and used it as a model to create a new constitution and a parliament. Japanese leaders eagerly supported industrialization and began building modern factories. As depicted here, you can probably imagine some similarities between their models of factories and ours for the Industrial Revolution. Railroads, steamships, and steel bridges began to pop up all over Japan. Japan built a modern military too, by modeling their army after the Germans and their navy after the British, which was one of the most iconic and renowned navies in the entire world. Japanese officials reformed their education system using models from German, American, and French public schools. Western fashions became really popular in Japan too. As seen by these pictures, cultural diffusion takes place not just in terms of ideas and philosophies, but also in tangible goods and products as well. Now, modernization in the Meiji era transformed Japan into the most industrial and militarized nation in all of Asia. In fact, by 1900, Japan had 7,000 miles of railroad track, thousands of factories, profitable tea, silk, shipbuilding industries, and a modern, advanced military. The Meiji reforms are often accredited to rebuilding Japan by ending the feudal system, distributing the land, by transforming public schools, by modernizing the army, by building a modern navy, of course, by adjusting the way that we view the emperor, looking at human rights and religious freedom a different way, a new written constitution which depicted Germany's for the time, and a modern banking system. All these changes and more definitely defined an era of change for Japan. Imperial Japan came to be because of rising nationalism as well that took place from these reforms. The Meiji reforms gave Japan power and respect, and Japanese nationalism led to the end to the Western extraterritorial rights and unequal trade treaties. Let's go ahead and do critical decision thinking number 3. So, moving back here, Japan's race to modernize paid off, and Japanese railroads, coal production, factories, and international trade meant that the Japanese economy had become as modern as any in the world. By 1890, the country had several dozen warships and 500,000 well-trained, well-armed soldiers. It had become the strongest military power in Asia, and Japan had gained military, political, and economic strength. In 1894, foreign powers accepted the abolition of extraterritorial rights for their citizens living in Japan, and Japan's feeling of strength and equality with the Western nations rose. By 1900, Japan's only real weakness was a lack of large supplies of natural resources such as iron and oil. As Japan's sense of power grew, the Japanese were determined to show the world that they were a powerful nation. So what should they do? Continue to focus on reforms and keeping Western nations from overpowering Japan in the future? Increase the trade of Japanese tea and silk for European shipments of iron and oil? Go to war with the Western nations in order to take French Indochina, Dutch East Indies, and British India? Follow the model of the industrialized Western nations and claim Japanese imperial territories in Asia? Well, here's what they actually do end up doing. Please make sure you check critical thinking decision number letter D. Because of this decision here that they made, by the 1890s, Japan saw itself as a modern nation that needed raw materials. Like other industrialized nations, Japan began to imperialize the rest of Asia. And so over time, they began to take over other parts of Asia. Japan looked to take Korea, but China always had claim to Korean land. Japan's dispute with China over Korea resulted in the Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895. Now, in this particular war, the Japanese and the Chinese would face off over territorial landholdings in Korea, and Japan's dispute with China over Korea resulted not only in this war, but also in an immense amount of loss of life. In a short time, however, Japan defeated the Chinese army and destroyed their navy. For their victory, Japan gained Taiwan and spheres of influence in China, and they began to take over mainland China. This woodblock print is an almost perfect example of how the Japanese saw themselves as totally different from the Chinese and fundamentally similar to the Westerners, seen here in the figures of Western advisors to the right, standing behind the Chinese. You can clearly see differences in this depiction. Now, after Japan's victory over China, a rivalry developed between Japan and Russia, too. From 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War began over control of the Port of Arthur and Manchuria in northern China. Now, in this type of endeavor, Japan humiliated Russia, shocking the world. During the war, Japan shocked the world by not only defeating this mighty Western power, but of course they were able to do so with great military might and advanced military tactics. In 1905, the US President Teddy Roosevelt helped draft the treaty between Japan and the defeated Russians that gave Korea to Japan and removed Russia from Manchuria. Now it seemed that Japan was the dominant force in this part of Asia. So Japan's victories over China and Russia transformed Japan into the dominant force in Asia. Western nations relied on Japan to keep order in Asia and be a model of government and military style. Unfortunately, though, Japanese imperialism surged again in the 1930s and 40s, which became a focal point for World War II, as you'll learn about in the next lesson. So think about this before we go on. How did in fact Japan change dramatically from these changes and events? And how did this give us World War II? When you think about that, it becomes quite clear that these events culminated into what we know as the War in the Pacific. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.